that a Camp Auschwitz shirt reared up in America's most sacred temple of democracy just last month. Muslim anti-Semitism is one of the themes we'll be addressing here tonight, but it bears noting that whether extreme right or left, religious or secular, Islamicist or white supremacist, today's voices of anti-Semitism have at least one thing in common: an othering of Jews that rejects basic notions of our shared humanity and rights. So with that in mind, it's my honor to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Minaz Afridi is the director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, where she's also associate professor of religious studies. Her work focuses on the Holocaust and the role of Muslims, anti-Semitism, and anti-Muslim sentiment. And as she puts it, she's a Muslim at a Catholic college teaching Judaism and Islam. Dr. Afridi will start us off with findings from her much acclaimed book, The Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. And thank you so much, Dr. Afridi.
Thank you so much, UJA-JCC, Greenwich. I feel at home with all of you. It's been wonderful to be invited back again, and also honored to be with Charles Osher Small, who I met in Jerusalem last time. So this is very interesting that we see each other on Zoom. I just want to say a few things about what we're going through. We've been going through COVID. There's a lot of angst in our communities worldwide, globally, in the United States. We had January 6th happen to us. We've had a lot of very contemporary issues, especially with the rise of anti-Semitism. It was last January that I spoke in front of 35,000 people at a rally in Brooklyn against anti-Semitism. So there has been a lot of turbulent times. There's also lots of conversations going on about racism in America. What are sort of, I would say, how do we feel? And how do we feel about each other being divided? And as an educator, I always say to my class that if we don't talk and have the courage to say what we really feel, we will never really learn from each other. And so as a Muslim, I wrote my book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, because of my own personal frustration and my own scholarly work, realizing that no Muslim had actually acknowledged the Shoah for what it was. And I also wanted to acknowledge the pain and suffering of Jews openly, without relativizing the Holocaust, without distorting the Holocaust, without denying the Holocaust, and to be very upfront about it. Not only that, but I also ventured to interview survivors during my time in Los Angeles. And I was very, very taken by their friendship and their relationship with me. And not only did I interview them, but they started to interview me about being a Muslim in my faith, which I thought was extraordinary. And following my journey through looking at anti-Semitism in Muslim Islamic extremist communities, I also work on white nationalism, is that I felt that there were three different faces of anti-Semitism, which is what this sort of program is called. And one of the faces was the Muslim and Arab anti-Semitism that was ingrained. And I wanted to know why. I was very curious to know what happened, why there was this European style of anti-Semitism, the complete ignorance of Muslims about the Holocaust and the Arabs. And so I started to study North Africa. And in North Africa, I found that there were camps under the Vichy government. And I looked at countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya. And I wrote about both the perpetrators, the bystanders, and also the wonderful rescue stories that have come about from that kind of research. The second part that bothers me, and I think most Muslim, is the extremist agenda within the Islamic communities, which is the extremist agenda is to annihilate Jews and to take from the verses of the Quran. If you read my book, there's a chapter called Is Islam Anti-Semitic? I answer no, and I explain why. But these verses are taken by extremists and used against Jews, used against Israel. And that to me was very problematic as a Muslim who is faithful to their faith. And then the third part, which is not completely contemporary, is anti-Zionism. I remember a long time ago, Janice Weinman, a friend of mine now from Hadassah, invited me to do a series on what is Zionism, because I felt that nobody really understood that word. That word became very amorphous. It became politicized in a way. Nobody knew the history of Herzl. No one knew the history of Eastern European Jewry, or how Jews migrated to Israel. So I took it upon myself to clarify these issues, but also to build bridges between the two communities in a way, which is a very tough thing and a challenging thing to do. When we have so many contemporary problems and political problems that go on between communities. But I also want to end, and I'm going to give it over to Charles, is that I really feel that living in New York and living in the United States is a complete blessing, because in the United States we have something called religious freedom. And I work with lots of organizations on the ground in New York and all over the nation with Jews and Muslims that are advocating together, that are working together, that are talking to one another and challenging one another to think about these issues. The summer before last, I took 52 women through the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom to Auschwitz and to Berlin. And it was one of the most moving things that I've ever done and led in my life. And we heard about the Muslim League going to Auschwitz, but what was really fascinating was to be with 52 women, dedicated, half Jewish, half Muslim, all ages, wanting to go and learn about each other's histories, and also for me to teach them about Islamophobia today in the European context. So I hope this conversation, and there's a lot to talk about here. It's a small field, but it's a growing field in terms of Muslims in the Holocaust. I'm pleased to say there's a series coming up in terms of that. But as a director of a Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center, I feel it's my duty to first focus on the lessons of the Holocaust. We cover other genocides and we do a lot of interfaith work, but primarily that has been my commitment at Manhattan College, which, as you know, as Laura said, is a Catholic college. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minaz. That was just fascinating. So I'll hold on. My screen has just decided to, there you go. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Asher Small. He is the founding director and president of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, monogrammed as ISGAP. His scholarly affiliations span too many hallowed halls of academe to enumerate here, but Oxford, Yale, and Tel Aviv University are three of them. Among his many writings is Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity, at last count 6 volumes. Dr. Small has also served as policy advisor on 4 continents about issues ranging from globalization to national identity to racism. Great to have you with us again. Thank you.
Charles, make sure to unmute in the bottom left-hand corner.
Cool. Okay. You can hear me? Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Pam and Laura and UJA-JCC for inviting me back. And Minaz, it was great to hear you speak and nice to see you again. As you said, the last time we met was in Jerusalem, and now we meet like everybody else, sort of virtually. I'm speaking rather from Oxford, England, so it's late here. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning, so forgive me if I'm slightly dragging, but I'm having my espresso as we speak. So I'm going to speak about contemporary anti-Semitism briefly. As Laura said, I'm the director of ISGAP, and ISGAP is an international research center. We do programming at universities around the world. We also train professors at Oxford University in a summer institute where we train professors to create courses on contemporary anti-Semitism, because the issues of contemporary anti-Semitism is essentially remains a taboo, and it's off the academic landscape. It's difficult in a way to get this on the map, but our colleagues are trying. Natan Sharansky is the chair of ISGAP, and Elie Wiesel was our first chair when we started about 17, 18 years ago. And Elie Wiesel always taught that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. That once this virulent form of anti-Semitism, or hatred rather, is unleashed upon society, it's an attack on humanity, an attack on God, an attack on anything that is democratic and human or decent. And I think his lessons and his teachings, obviously, in terms of Holocaust and remembrance and being a witness and being active in human rights, was extraordinary. And I remember in 2003, he said that he was never so alarmed at rising anti-Semitism, and he said that we were living in a time of great urgency. And he went on to correct himself, and this was in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa in 2003. He went on to correct himself. He says, no, we are not living in a time of urgency. We're living in a time of a great emergency. He was never so afraid of the rise of anti-Semitism in 2003 as he was since the end of the Holocaust in 1945. And 17, 18 years later, we all know on this call that anti-Semitism is increasing and truly becoming an emergency. I'm going to speak briefly about contemporary anti-Semitism. We all know, and it was mentioned earlier, the concerns, January the 6th, the rise of right-wing extremism in the United States, of nationalism and xenophobia, not only in the United States, but throughout much of the world. We have the rise of the radical right. We have the rise of radical left, and the radical left demonizes notions of Jewish peoplehood. The radical right primarily attacks Jews as being the wrong, inferior, conspiring race. So we have two extreme forms of anti-Semitism. And I'll just say very briefly, there's three major types of anti-Semitism historically, and I think what makes anti-Semitism so important to understand is that it's, as Robert Wistrich and other great scholars of anti-Semitism would argue, that there's something inherently genocidal about anti-Semitism. The three phases of anti-Semitism, in just give me 2 minutes, I'll be brief, but bear with me for being so general, is that when the dominant perspective of perceiving reality was through the lens of religion, and namely European Christianity, the Jew was perceived as someone or somebody that needed to be redeemed. And in order for the Jew to be redeemed, they had to accept the Christian notion of the Messiah. And if they didn't accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, there could be no redemption for the Jew. But what makes anti-Semitism inherently genocidal is that the Christians also taught that it was the Jews who were hindering not only their individual redemption, but of the world's redemption, of global redemption. And until the stubborn Jew would accept the Christian notion of being saved, the world would not be redeemed. And this, of course, as we know, resulted in pogroms, that resulted in forced conversion and exile. We know the long history of Christian anti-Semitism and religious anti-Semitism. When the dominant lens of the way we perceive the world shifted from religion to notions of science and race and eugenics and nation, the Jew living in different parts of the world, namely in Europe and in other places of the world, in the Middle East and North Africa, they suddenly became the wrong people in the wrong place. They were the wrong race or the wrong nation. And what made anti-Semitism, or this racist form of anti-Semitism, so virulent is that the white Aryan race, people were taught through theology, through science, through philosophy, through social sciences, that the purity of the white Aryan race and the white nation, in order for it to be saved, the Jew had to be removed. And unlike the time of the religious Christian form of anti-Semitism, one could not convert the race. We were taught, and we all know this is now a social construction, that race is an idea that was justified in all sorts of ways, that in order for the white Aryan race to be saved, the Jew had to be removed. And this type of racist anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust. And we know that these forms of anti-Semitism are around, but not as prevalent as the contemporary or the dominant form of anti-Semitism. And the dominant form of anti-Semitism is now an attack on who Jews are as a people. So if a university professor or a journalist in the media of record would speak in the ways of the old Christian forms of anti-Semitism or in the racist form of anti-Semitism, we all know that this would not be tolerated in our liberal institutions in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and in most parts of the world. But to demonize a Jew for who they are, not only is it acceptable, I would argue, and other scholars would argue, but you actually get rewarded. Demonize Israel, boycott Israel, call Israel an apartheid, racist, colonial, fascist entity, and in our halls of higher education, in our media of record, I would argue that students and faculty and journalists are actually rewarded for these critical views of Israel. So now many of us in the United States, in Western Europe, when the people were demonizing Israel and demonizing Zionism, many of us in our successful, comfortable communities in the United States and Canada, we've said for many decades, well, this is a problem for our stubborn Israeli brothers or cousins in the Middle East. And if only the Israelis would make peace with the Palestinians, these issues would be diminished and would go away. And this form of anti-Zionism or this forms of demonizing Israelis would go away. But we know that the demonization of Israel, if Israel is an apartheid, racist, colonial, pinkwashing state, and every negative epithet that you can imagine, if this is true, from a liberal human rights perspective, that entity must be dismantled. So the boycott movement, people that demonize Israel in such a way, we have to understand if it's true what they're saying, the end game is to dismantle the state. If it is such an aberration in the eyes of international law and Western liberal democratic principles. So as Israel is being demonized, we now know that other Jewish communities in Europe, in France, in England, in Belgium, and now we see in the United States loud and clear, if Israel is an apartheid state, a racist colonial state, and Jewish people in Paris, in Greenwich, in New York are walking to shul on Shabbat, if Jewish students have the courage to walk into a Hillel or to a Chabad house or a Jewish student organization, or to say in the classroom that they are proud of their people, they're proud of their ancestral and historic and cultural and religious and perhaps personal connection to the land of Israel, then they are also demonized. And in these postmodern liberal spaces of universities and in our media of record, if you have an affinity to a racist, apartheid, fascist entity, then you become a problem. You become targeted in these communities. And we now know, studies have shown, in universities in the United States, Barry Cosman has done a very important study measuring anti-Semitism at American universities. He studied racism, sexism, and anti-Semitism. And he discovered that approximately 22% of female students at liberal arts colleges in the United States and universities, 22% of women have experienced or witnessed a sexist act in a 6-month period. About 33% of African Americans have experienced racism or witnessed a racist attack, or a racist incident rather, in a university campus, whereas close to 80% of Jewish students have witnessed or experienced an anti-Semitic act in the same 6-month period. 80%. So the levels of anti-Semitism, the demonization of Israel on campuses, in our liberal institutions, is something that should be of tremendous concern to a community like Greenwich, to the Jewish community of Connecticut and the United States and other Western liberal societies. In a study that I did with Ed Kaplan at Yale University, we interviewed 10,000 Europeans and asked them a series of questions about classical forms of anti-Semitism and what we called questions regarding bashing Israel. And we found that there was actually a low level of anti-Semitism and a low level of Israel bashers. But what we also found is that those who bash Israel are 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense compared to the rest of these European societies. So the correlation in demonizing Israel and demonizing Jewish peoplehood, and anti-Semitism is off the charts. If we sold a product like a bottle of water in our supermarket and one brand was 13 times more likely to cause cancer, we know this water would be removed from the shelves, and there'd be an inquiry on how this product was able to poison people for so long. So the anti-Semitism on the left is very important to understand. And I would argue, and I think this touches on some of the issues of Muslim anti-Semitism, in a sense, the West's and the intellectual left in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, this sort of, we call it the Red-Green Alliance. So there's sort of this postmodern liberal moment in which we live in philosophically, and I won't get too deep into it, but there is a sort of a critique of Western and American hegemony and power, and political Islam. And political Islam, which many of us don't understand the difference between Islam, Muslims, and political Islam. Very quickly, political Islam is a reactionary social movement that began in Egypt roughly 100 years ago. Some of its intellectual founders were Qutb and al-Banna. They started in Egypt as a reaction to British colonialism, and they basically took a very narrow reactionary understanding of Islam and fused it with this reactionary ideology coming out of Europe using the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a forged document that emerges in Europe in the 1890s that speaks about a cabal, a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world and to control banks. And it was these words and ideas, and Elie Wiesel always taught that the Holocaust didn't start with the crematoriums or the railroad tracks to the concentration camps. It began with words and ideas. And the words and ideas of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion lay the foundation to remove Jews from society, put them into ghettos, take them out of universities, take them out of their places of employment, put them in ghettos, and eventually lead them to the concentration camps and the final solution. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was fused by Islam, by the Muslim Brotherhood 100 years ago in Egypt, and is the foundation of political Islam, not Islam, not Muslims, but this very specific kind of reactionary social movement. And this reactionary social movement takes European anti-Semitism, plagiarizes it, puts it as a central core element of its ideology, and blames the Jews for all sorts of things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and not only calls for the destruction of Israel, but for the annihilation of the Jewish people. And this social movement has caused such devastation in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq. It controls the Iranian revolutionary regime, and yet,
So Charles,
yes,
I just want to respond because we want to have a conversation soon. But
sure.
I wanted to kind of back up a little bit because we can get into.
Can, can I just
God, yeah,
can I just sum up in a minute and then we'll,
sure, yeah.
okay, thanks. So now I lost my trend of thought, sorry. So,
Iran.
pardon?
You were talking about Iran and Syria.
Yeah, so the Iranian revolutionary regime, its ideological roots come from the Muslim Brotherhood, the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, even though Iran is a Shiite country. And what I find alarming is here's a social movement that calls for the annihilation of Israel and the Jewish people. Yosef Kawadawi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, preaches consistently for decades that the true believer is obligated to finish the work of Hitler. And yet, the Muslim Brotherhood has been funding American universities in the tune of billions of dollars. We did a major research project in ISGAP for this and helped to uncover the funding of $3 billion from the Muslim Brotherhood to American universities. This has resulted in a federal investigation to Muslim Brotherhood funding. So there's been a red-green alliance and acquiescence to the Muslim Brotherhood. And just to sum up, and I kind of end in mid-thought, because I really want to enter into a conversation with Manaz, and I don't want to take too much time. But I think people like Haris Rafiq and other Muslim intellectuals fighting reactionary Islam, have been very troubled by the fact that Western European governments, the United States, various American administrations have propped up and engaged in engaged with the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East, and also their representatives in Western Europe and North America. And I would argue that this alliance, we call it the Red-Green Alliance, has placed Muslim communities in Europe and in North America in danger, because by courting extremists, I think this, in a way, paints an entire community, an entire people in a very negative way, and not only promotes anti-Semitism, but I think it also promotes sort of anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic sentiment in the West as well. So I'll end there and be happy to have a conversation. So Minaz, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, that was a lot. That's like the history of I mean, it's a lot of stuff. So I mean, my interest and my focus is looking at, how Muslims and Arabs actually started to become more anti-Semitic in terms of the European anti-Semitism. And some of the work I've done I think is really important, is looking at the influence of the Germans on the Arab countries. We're talking about, pre-1945, so we're talking really, 1941 to 1944, the propaganda that went into these countries. David Muttadil has a wonderful book called Islam and Nazi Germany. I just want to sort of slow down and think about, and pick up on your idea of the red and green line, and look at this notion of imperialism, and also liberalism, because I think what's going on, and for me it's a double whammy, right? I mean, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Pakistani, I'm actually a woman of color, I'm Asian, I work on the Holocaust, and I also teach Islam and the Quran, and I get a lot of questions about, oh, the Quran says this against the Jews, and the Quran says this against the Christians, and the Quran does this, and the Hadith says this, and isn't Islam political? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are all these problems when we read sacred texts, right? There's all these problems in our traditions. And one of the most important things that we are told in the Quran, just like in the Torah, is that one has to be self-critical. And one has no idea what God is actually saying. That's the first thing. There is also ilm, knowledge, which is to contextualize, to look at the history, to understand that things are not chronological. And the most important thing for me as a Muslim is that we are not authentic and pure, but come with our own human error as people. So I have learned this from the Islamic tradition, and I have learned a lot from Holocaust studies about suffering and colonization. And one of the things that we can learn about what Charles was saying, perhaps, is this idea of imperialism, a colonization that Muslims and Arabs feel all over the world, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And I think what's important for us, so that we can actually have a conversation and not accuse each other of these things, is to sort of stop at a moment and think. So here you have a whole population that really doesn't understand Judaism, right? And we're talking about 1920s, 30s, 40s. We don't even have to come to 2021 right now. They don't have any understanding of Jews coming in from Europe. They don't know necessarily about the camps in Eastern Europe. They don't know about anti-Semitism. However, at the same time, you have the demise of the Arab world, the kind of falling of an empire. You have a desperate people that were at one point the most productive, the most enlightened group of people. And these moments are really important. There are different moments in history to look at, but they're very important moments of history. And when you talk to Jews and Muslims together and in separate places about these moments, there is aha moments. Why is this important? We know anti-Semitism exists. It's to understand how anti-Semitism became a mythology in the Arab and the Muslim world. It's not just the Quran, I would argue, but lots of other things. And it was pre-Israel because of this propaganda. But also, there was not this kind of golden era of Jews and Muslims living together under Muslims. There were problems between the Muslim Empire and Jews and Christians. So one of the ways that I want us to think about these issues is not that, okay, this is what Muslims do and this is what Jews do or this is what Christians do, but the problems of seeing each other's history or reading each other's text in a context that is meaningful, that is actually productive, rather than these are the problems that we have. How do we think about these things, understand that anti-Semitism is a bigger problem, and I argue this in my Muslim audiences, than Islamophobia. And I can walk down the street and experience Islamophobia quite a bit here in New York. I'll give you a story. When I was in Berlin 3 years ago, I had written a response to Simon Wiesenthal's Sonnenblumen, the sunflower, and it was from a Muslim perspective. Would a Muslim forgive the SS soldier for crimes? And I was hosted by my friend who is American, but she now lives in Berlin for 30 years. She took me to a beautiful restaurant and in Wilnsdorf, and she introduced me to her friends. She said, "Oh my God, look, this is my friend Mehnaz. She's here from New York. She's Muslim. She does Holocaust studies. She just was, at the Berlin Literature House." And there were a few people there that shocked her and I. And these are local German people. And they said to me, "Could you not find something better to do and teach than the Holocaust? And perhaps we will accept you because you don't wear that thing on your head." So here I was in Berlin 3 years ago experiencing this at one very moment, right? So how does one negotiate that as a human being? And when Charles talks about how anti-Semitism is actually a sin against humanity, right? It's a sin against human beings. How does one negotiate that being a Jew or a Muslim today? And I think that's where I'm interested. I'm not interested in us fighting about each other's verses, but I'm interested in us thinking about how perhaps we have been taught and constructed in these different various ways so that we can actually have a challenging conversation.
Charles, you're muted again. Just unmute in the bottom left.
See, I'm muted. It's anti-Semitism. I'm kidding. Manas, thank you for your comments. So thank you. You've made me think of many things, and I'll try and be concise. I find it interesting the sort of in the United States, the sort of notion of racialized identities. The generation of my grandparents, who were four of them were refugees because of all sorts of reasons in the Middle East and in Europe, Jewish. In Europe, their generation were exterminated because they were the wrong race. They weren't white. And now in our institutions of discussion and enlightenment and education, the Jew is the quintessential elitist white. In such a short period of history, we've shifted from not being white and contaminating the purity of the white race to being white elitists. And it's not, you're a white, sorry for what happened in the past and welcome to the club. No, now we're the quintessential imperialist, colonialist, apartheid group. One interesting thing. And I think touching on the more hopeful part of your comments, I was taught the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas brings Pirkei Avot, he brings Talmudic thought into the university for the first time, Jewish ethics. And he famously said that the moment we see our face in the face of the other, the moment we see our face in the face of the other, that's the instant we're human. So it's not a form of tolerance, it's a form of humility. We need the other to be human. And if I'm racist and I don't like Africans, I've lost 1 billion or more opportunities to learn and to be wiser. If I'm sexist, 51% of my opportunities to become a human are out the window. So we need the other to be human. And yes, so I agree. And if we could recognize the humanity in us and that we're all created in the image of God, we all have truth, and life is literally sacred, then yes, I think then the conversation and the learning can begin.
Well, I mean, I think it's also about accepting each other's suffering at different times, right? I'm not at all equating the Holocaust to anything like colonization, but to understand each other's suffering or to understand each other's losses at different historical moments is extremely important. Um, you talk about the campuses. I've talked openly about the problems on campuses and how anti-Semitic campuses can be. I'm at Manhattan College. We do have Jewish students, and they are protected because my Muslim students who are there I'm their advisor. So it's about leadership, right? It's about leadership. So if my Muslim students come to me and say, "Hey, Dr. Friedli, we want to bring someone who is, anti-Israel," I will say no, and they'll say why, and I'll say this is why. So I think there's a lack of leadership on our campuses. I think there is a real trepidation of accepting Israel as a Jewish state, like I have openly. There's a real kind of nervousness and fear of that because, Charles, you're correct in the sense that Israelis are seen as the colonizer today. Even though they're marginalized, right? Even for being the colonizer, it's a marginalization. But I want to also, it's a very interesting thing. When you look at the history of Palestine before Israel, and you look at how Arabs viewed European Jews coming to Palestine, it was through the lens that they were given of the colonizer. They didn't see Jews coming into Palestine. They saw colonizers coming from Europe, from places like Russia and Germany, these places that had sort of victimized them. And so I think that's why we have to revisit and look at how we perceive each other, right? How we think about each other, because then we're not going to move from this terrible challenge of not accepting Israel, not accepting Palestinian suffering at the same time, and accepting these things very openly without feeling compromised, right? So I'll give you an example. I get criticized a lot. Why don't you do Palestine for a program? Well, I don't think Palestinians are experiencing genocide. And I'll explain, and I can explain why, because I'm a genocide scholar as well, right? So I'm a Holocaust scholar. So what? But I have had a Palestinian and an Israeli come to my campus and have a conversation. So there's very different ways of approaching
For sure.
people. I mean, and the thing is, you want to educate people so that they can be challenged and not be reaffirmed by the misperceptions of each other.
Sure. So well said. So Manaz, I think one of the things of anti-Semitism or the of all forms of discrimination is when people are defined by the other, and usually for positions from a position of, I guess, from a political agenda of domination. And I think for 2,000 years, and I don't want to go into the whole history of 2,000 years, but in a sense, the Jew has been defined by others. And I think what's imperative for people to if there is really going to be a dialogue and understanding and acceptance and reconciliation and with a sense of humility to see the other, the Jew will define who they are. And we must have the power to define ourselves. So even, and I don't want to get into the weeds of it, but in your description of colonialism in Israel and Palestine, of course, I have a different perspective. I'm coming from a different perspective. So before the modern state of Israel was established, there was Palestine. What was Palestine? Who defined Palestine? Was it the British? Was it the Turks? Was it the French? Was it the Romans? Was this the first, perhaps, from 2,000 years ago? If you speak of colonization, the Romans named the land after the Philistines, which were the greatest enemy of the Jewish people, right? So that's from our memory, that's deep. So we don't see ourselves as establishing the state of Israel. We see ourselves and understand ourselves as reestablishing our home. And that's a narrative. It's not the only narrative, but that's a very important narrative. And of course, as you know, the largest group of Israelis are Jews from the region, are Mizrahi Jews, are Jews from North Africa and the Middle East. That's the largest group of Israelis who, as you know, were forced from their homes. Nobody leaves their homes at that level such a large majority of people leaving Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Iran and North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria, and find themselves, the many went to Israel and to other parts of France and Quebec and other parts of the world. So that history and that understanding. So I think the Muslim world lived with Jewish communities, and fatwas and the way Jews were defined in Persia and other parts of the world as dhimmis, a second class, not even citizens, is something that Mizrahi Jews would not tolerate to go back to. And I think one, and I'll stop this series of comments on a hopeful note. I believe I was the first. I'm also Israeli. I was the first Israeli and Jewish person to speak at the Muslim World League conference about 3 years ago, and one of the first to enter into dialogue with the Muslim World League. As you know, the Muslim World League was, I guess, ground zero for anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and really a reactionary form of Islam. I think Dr. Muhammad Al-Isa, who you said took a delegation of Islamic leaders to Auschwitz, is a true reformer, and he's really, and I think at least at the upper echelons of the Muslim World League is based in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, and is perhaps the most important Sunni organization in the Islamic world. And there is really, I think, a strong movement now of reconciliation, of rapprochement with the Jewish community and Israel and the Western world, and putting forward moderate people who are not part of the sort of political Islamic Muslim Brotherhood reactionary element of this vast Islamic, I hate to use the term Islamic world, and is becoming more and more moderate, changing textbooks, stopping imams who are very reactionary from preaching in their mosques. So I think this is the beginning of hope, changing the textbooks, changing the Islamic leadership that you speak of. If this reconciliation goes forward, I think and I hope and I pray that this will really be the beginning of a wonderful new era. I hope.
Dr. Afridi, a couple of questions have come in sort of in between the two conversations, asking you if maybe you could tell us what you think, if you could explain to us how you see the difference when lay people like us use the difference between the word Muslim and Islam, and also in relation to to Israel as colonizers. How would you put into context the slaughter in Hebron in 1929, before there was a state of Israel, an official state of Israel? Maybe we'll start with that.
Okay, so let me go to Muslim and Islam. So Muslim is a person who submits to God. So someone who practices Islam is a Muslim. Like a Christian practices Christianity, like a Jew practices Judaism. Islam is the religion, the umbrella. So you don't say Islamic people, you say Muslims instead. I remember, a good friend of mine, and I think Charles knows him, is Reuven Firestone, said to me once when I was in LA working with him, he said, Mehnaz, don't ever say Jewish people, just say Jews, just say Jews. And I remember him saying that to me. So, I mean, it's like Muslims, right? And I remember not all Arabs are Muslims. There are Jewish Arabs and there are Christian Arabs, and we keep forgetting that. And not all Muslims are Arabs. Asians are in the majority in terms of being Muslim. So that's just one clarification. Second, in terms of the colonizer, it's not my perception. The way that I see that Arabs write about this is that they're perceiving them as colonizers because they're coming from Europe. It's not my personal perception. It's a perception that was ingrained in the minds because of before 1929 and the massacre, but in 1922 when the Ottoman Empire fell. So the trickle of migration of European Jews strictly, I'm not talking about Mizrahi or Sephardic, but I'm talking about European Jews coming in from 1870s on in different masses, right? Being seen, perceived as colonizers. So I want to clarify that, and that becomes this kind of after that perception, it's almost like nobody wants to listen to anything, right? If you're perceiving that. So that's where I think we have some room to say, wait a second, let's look at the history of Palestine. As Charles said, let's look at the fact that Jews were actually in Palestine. They didn't just appear. And I think that's another kind of place where things get censored historically that we need to talk about. Does that clarify?
May I say something?
Yeah.
So so it's interesting. There's an African proverb that says that a true understanding of the hunt will only be known when the lions have their own historians. My question would be, why is there such a horribly negative perception, not only of Israel, but of the Jewish people in the region? And I would argue that that miseducation comes from the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood and the influence that the Muslim Brotherhood and at various points historically of Arab nationalism, of pan-Arab nationalism and Nasserism had on the education and the popular culture in the region. So the demonization of Israel, as you said, the influence of Germany, the influence of Christian missionaries during colonial period, fascism, Nazism, the Brotherhood. There's been this, this horrible level of anti-Semitism in the region's education, in its religious teachings, in its schools, even in its popular culture. And I hope that, with this beginning, maybe it's the Abrahamic Accords, maybe there's this sort of a window of rapprochement where we could begin to see each other as we really are, not through the sort of the prism of misinformation and caricatures of each other. And I think if we begin to see each other and see the commonalities and see the connections that we all have to the region and our history, maybe and hopefully we can start to see each other as truly human and begin to rebuild our lives in a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood.
I'm going to jump in with some questions from the chat room. So, for instance, to Menaz, if you were talking about some of the difficult verses in the Quran, so if you want to just give a sense, please, if you could respond to them to quell, in a certain sense, Jewish concerns about them. And a question here is, which are the most effective approaches to persuade non-Jews that anti-Semitism is damaging to their own interests and that they should be allies and be active in combating anti-Semitism? So
well, it's funny because I'm teaching a senior seminar and it's just on the Quran. It's called the Study Quran, and it's kind of fun. And I usually do courses on Muslims in America, Islamic literature, but I just did this because I think it's a journey for me in my senior and junior majors. And we just finished a Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second Surah. It's called the Cow. And if you haven't read it, you should, because it's really addressed to the children of Israel. And my students who are Catholic, there's one Jew and mostly secular and a couple of Muslims, were shocked because they hadn't really looked at this, right? And they said, wait, how come the Quran is addressing the children of Israel? It's not just, Jews, but it's really the children of Israel. And so we had a really interesting conversation about, how God made a covenant with the children of Israel, which the Quran states very clearly, and a covenant with Abraham. And then, it changes, and the problem is that it changes that Jews and Christians somehow didn't get the word, but they're not condemned, that they will have redemption. The problematic verses are not necessarily in the Quran. The problematic verses for me are the kind of genre of the Sirah, which is the Hadith, is very problematic, where you have, nuances of not trusting Jews, being allowed to kill them. But then if you read the Quran and you look at the notion that Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Sabians, which is a group we don't know much about, are going to be redeemed equally as you are, and only God will be the judge, over and over again. And then there are a couple of places where there are very offensive alliterations to apes and pigs that becomes problematic. I've written on this before. If you want, I can send you the complete transliteration on it. I also want to say very clearly to all of you, with absolutely, no hesitation, is that there are many, many problems in sacred text. And there are many, many problems in Islam, although I'm a believer and I'm a Muslim. And I'll say that because I think that if I don't think that, then I wouldn't be here in any way. If I didn't think that, that there is a problem of anti-Semitism in my community, I would never be here. If I thought that Israel shouldn't exist, I wouldn't be here. So there's a lot of things, and I think that comes from the sense of faith, because Islam teaches us this social justice and this sort of critical lens. And for Jews especially, it's the concept of God, and to really encapsulate and understand what God is actually meaning in the Torah or the Quran. It's the same concept in Islam, right? We're constantly asking ourselves, do we have the meaning? But as Charles points out, the Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Daesh, as we call them, will take it as literalism, right? Just like the Crusades, during the Crusades, right? This is how I can teach my Catholic students. Literalize these verses and use them over and over again in educational systems, and the already mythology of anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism. Coupled with all of this is problematic, and this is where we should be looking and working together. And I think a lot of people, if you ask them in Europe or in Asia, or even in the Arab world, or in Pakistan where I was born, and you say, well, why are you so anti-Semitic? They won't really remember. Honestly, they'll have no clue. They'll say, oh, doesn't the Quran say, or didn't they do this to Muhammad? But they're not really clear and sure. But they know they have to have this hatred. And that's the problem, right? They don't even have, and I'll say, well, what did the Jews do? Well, I don't know. Have you met a Jew? No. So these are the very deep-rooted problems that I deal with in my work, because it's important for us to have these conversations.
Oh, it's just so profound, and I'm so sorry we're out of time. So interesting. I see that we probably need 45 hours with instead of 45 minutes with. But so thank you so much, Dr. Manaz Afridi and Dr. Charles Usher Small. And of course, thanks to Classrooms Without Borders and Lois and Bruce and Kel. Thank you all for being here. And I guess we'll have to have part 2.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was an honor. Thank you,
Thank you very
Charles.
much. Thank you. It was an honor for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.